Everyone in the classroom thought I was about to get in trouble, but nobody expected what my professor said next. I still remember the silence that filled the room when I opened my eyes and realized Professor Michael Carter was standing beside my desk. My head had been resting on my notebook, my unfinished assignment was still open in front of me, and every student around me suddenly became very interested in avoiding eye contact. I was Ethan Brooks, a 21-year-old college student who had always tried to stay unnoticed. I was not the person who raised a hand first, the person who sat in the front row, or the person professors remembered easily. I was usually somewhere in the middle of the classroom, hoping my work would speak for itself. But that morning, my exhaustion became impossible to hide. Professor Carter was known across campus as one of the most serious instructors in the department. His lectures were organized, his expectations were high, and his attention to detail was something every student respected. Many people described him as intimidating, but I always thought he was simply someone who cared deeply about his subject. Still, being caught sleeping during his class felt like the worst possible mistake. I prepared myself for a warning, a disappointed look, or maybe a conversation about responsibility. Instead, Professor Carter looked at me calmly and said, "Stay after class. We need to talk." Those words immediately made my mind race. I wondered if I had failed an assignment, missed something important, or somehow given him the wrong impression. The rest of the lecture passed slowly. I tried to focus, but my thoughts kept returning to that sentence. Stay after class. We need to talk. When the other students left the room, I slowly packed my things. The classroom that usually felt comfortable suddenly seemed much larger and quieter. Professor Carter sat at his desk reviewing some papers before looking up at me. I expected criticism. Instead, he asked a question I never saw coming. "How long have you been trying to handle everything by yourself?" I was confused. That was not the conversation I expected. I thought he would talk about my grades or my behavior, but he seemed more interested in understanding what was happening. I did not know how much he had noticed. I did not know that my missed deadlines, tired appearance, and quiet attitude had been telling a story I thought nobody could see. For a moment, I considered giving a simple answer and leaving. But something about the way he asked made me stop. It did not feel like a professor questioning a student. It felt like someone trying to understand another person. I looked down at my notebook and finally admitted that I had been struggling to keep up. Between classes, my part-time job, and the pressure I placed on myself, I had reached a point where I was constantly tired. Professor Carter listened without interrupting. Then he said something that changed the way I saw him. Sometimes the people who look like they are falling behind are actually the ones carrying the most. That was the moment I realized this conversation was not about punishment. It was about something I had been hiding for longer than I wanted to admit. After that conversation with Professor Michael Carter, I walked out of the classroom feeling different, but I could not explain why. I had expected to feel embarrassed after being caught sleeping during class. Instead, I felt like someone had finally noticed something I had been trying to hide. The strange part was that Professor Carter did not make me feel judged. He made me feel understood. The next few days, I kept thinking about our conversation. I wondered how he had noticed the signs I thought I was hiding so well. I was careful about showing up on time, completing my assignments, and acting like everything was fine. But apparently, my efforts to appear normal were not as successful as I believed. Professor Carter had seen the small changes, the late submissions, the quiet moments during discussions, the way I looked exhausted even when I tried to stay focused. During the next class, I expected things to feel uncomfortable. I thought maybe he would treat me differently or mention our conversation. Instead, he continued teaching as usual. He explained literature, asked questions, and challenged everyone to think deeper. Nothing about his behavior suggested that our private conversation had happened. That actually made me respect him more. He was not trying to embarrass me or make me feel like I needed special attention. He simply gave me space. After class, I found a note on my desk with a simple message from Professor Carter. It said, "Sometimes the first step to improving your situation is admitting that something needs to change." I kept that note because the words stayed with me. That evening, I thought about why I had been struggling so much. I realized I had spent months trying to prove that I could handle everything alone. I was balancing my classes, my part-time job at a local bookstore, and my own expectations of becoming successful quickly. I had convinced myself that asking for help meant I was failing. But maybe the opposite was true. Maybe recognizing when I needed support was actually a sign of maturity. The following week, Professor Carter asked me to visit his office during his regular student hours. I walked there wondering what he wanted to discuss. When I arrived, he showed me some of my previous assignments and pointed out something I had never noticed. "Your ideas are strong," he said, "but you do not trust yourself enough." His words surprised me because I had always focused on my weaknesses. I had never considered that confidence could be the missing piece. Professor Carter explained that many talented students struggled because they were too focused on their mistakes instead of their potential. He told me that education was not only about receiving grades. It was about learning how to grow. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was encouraging me instead of simply evaluating me. I left his office with a different perspective. I still had responsibilities. I still had challenges. But I no longer felt like I had to carry everything silently. And that was when I started wondering why Professor Carter understood my situation so well. Because the more he talked about struggle and self-doubt, the more it sounded like he was describing something he had experienced himself. The question I could not stop thinking about was why Professor Michael Carter seemed to understand my struggles so well. At first, I believed he was simply a professor who paid close attention to his students. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing small details that made me wonder if there was a deeper reason behind his advice. During one of our meetings, Professor Carter looked through some of my recent work and then leaned back in his chair. "You know, I used to think being successful meant never showing weakness," he said. That sentence caught my attention because it sounded less like a lesson from a professor and more like a confession from someone who had lived through the same experience. I asked him what he meant, and for the first time he shared a little about his own past. Before becoming a professor, Michael Carter had been a student who struggled with confidence and uncertainty. He explained that he once spent years trying to prove himself to everyone around him. He believed every mistake was a sign that he was not good enough. The pressure eventually made him forget why he loved learning in the first place. Listening to him was surprising because I had always imagined professors as people who had everything figured out. I never considered that they also had moments when they felt lost. Professor Carter told me that one person changed the way he saw himself during that difficult period. A mentor had noticed his potential before he could see it himself. That person did not give him easy answers. Instead, they asked questions that helped him discover his own strengths. "Sometimes people do not need someone to fix their problems," Professor Carter said. "Sometimes they just need someone to remind them that they are capable." Those words stayed with me because they explained why he had spoken to me after class. He was not trying to make me dependent on his guidance. He was trying to help me believe in myself. After that conversation, I started approaching my classes differently. I organized my schedule better, asked questions when I needed clarification, and stopped pretending that everything was always under control. The changes were small, but they mattered. I began noticing that confidence was not something people suddenly gained. It was something they built through small decisions every day. One afternoon, after a class discussion, Professor Carter stopped me in the hallway. He told me that my recent work showed improvement and that he was glad I had started trusting my own ideas more. I thanked him, but I also told him something I had never said before. I think I needed someone to notice before I could admit I was struggling. He smiled and nodded. Most people do. That moment changed the way I viewed our conversations. I realized Professor Carter was not just sharing advice. He was passing forward the same kindness someone had once shown him. But there was still one thing I wanted to understand. If he had experienced similar struggles, why had he never told anyone before? And what else was he keeping behind the calm and confident image everyone saw in the classroom? The more I learned about Professor Michael Carter, the more I realized that the person standing in front of the classroom was very different from the image most students had of him. To everyone else, he was the professor with high expectations, the person who always arrived prepared, and the instructor who never seemed uncertain. But after our conversations, I started seeing the person behind that professional image. One afternoon, I stayed after class to discuss my latest assignment. I expected another conversation about my progress, but instead, Professor Carter opened a drawer in his desk and took out an old notebook. The cover was worn, and the pages inside looked like they had been read many times. "I kept this for a reason," he said, "because sometimes we forget how far we have come." He opened the notebook and showed me notes from when he was a college student. The handwriting was his, but the thoughts sounded strangely familiar. He had written about feeling overwhelmed, questioning his abilities, and wondering if he belonged in the academic world. I was surprised because those were the same feelings I had been trying to hide. Seeing those words changed the way I viewed him. He was not someone who had always known the right answers. He was someone who had once asked the same questions I was asking. Professor Carter explained that his own mentor had helped him during that difficult period. That person noticed his potential before he noticed it himself. Instead of telling him what path to follow, the mentor encouraged him to discover what he truly wanted. That experience shaped the way he approached teaching. He wanted his students to understand that mistakes were not proof of failure. They were part of learning. The hardest thing for many people is accepting that they are still becoming who they are meant to be, he said. I thought about that sentence for a long time. I had spent so much energy comparing myself to people who seemed more successful, more confident, and more prepared. I never considered that many of them might have struggled with the same doubts. After that day, my relationship with Professor Carter changed in a way I did not expect. I still respected him as my professor, but I also appreciated him as someone who understood the challenges of growth. I started participating more in class discussions and sharing my ideas without worrying that every answer had to be perfect. One day, after I presented a project in front of the class, Professor Carter told me something simple. "You finally stopped apologizing for having your own perspective." That comment stayed with me because I realized he was right. I had spent so much time trying to avoid being wrong that I forgot learning required curiosity. However, as the semester continued, I noticed something interesting. Professor Carter was always encouraging others, but he rarely talked about himself. He helped students recognize their strengths, yet he never mentioned his own challenges unless someone asked. I began wondering what happened during his journey that made him become this kind of teacher. There was clearly more to his story than he had shared, and I had a feeling that the answer was connected to a decision he made many years earlier, a decision that changed the entire direction of his life. The more time I spent around Professor Michael Carter, the more I understood that his calm confidence was built from years of experience, not from a life without difficulties. I had always assumed that people who guided others had somehow figured everything out. But my conversations with him showed me something different. Sometimes the people who help others the most are the ones who remember exactly what it feels like to struggle. A few weeks after our first conversation, I noticed a change in the way I approached my own challenges. I was no longer trying to hide every mistake or pretend that everything was easy. I started asking questions, managing my time better, and accepting that improvement took patience. But there was still one thing I wanted to know. What made Professor Carter decide to become the kind of person who noticed students like me? One afternoon after class, I finally asked him. He was quiet for a moment before answering. "I was not always someone who wanted to teach," he said. His response surprised me. I expected him to talk about his passion for education, but instead, he told me about a turning point from many years earlier. When Michael Carter was a student, he had once reached a point where he considered giving up on his academic goals. He felt disconnected from his own abilities and believed that everyone around him was moving forward while he was falling behind. The person who helped him was one of his professors. That professor noticed something in him that he could not see himself. Instead of focusing only on his mistakes, the professor asked questions about his interests, his goals, and what kind of future he wanted to create. "That conversation changed everything for me," Michael explained. "Someone believed in me before I was ready to believe in myself." Hearing that made me realize why he had reacted differently when he found me sleeping in class. He was not only seeing a tired student. He was seeing a younger version of himself. He understood that sometimes a small moment could reveal a much bigger struggle. The following week, Professor Carter invited me to help with a student research project. It was not because I had the highest grades or the most experience. He told me he wanted me to challenge myself and discover what I was capable of doing. First, I was nervous. I worried that I would disappoint him. But instead of judging my uncertainty, he encouraged me to treat it as part of the process. Working on the project taught me something important. Confidence did not appear before taking action. It developed because I was willing to try. As the semester continued, I began noticing small changes in myself. I spoke more during discussions. I shared ideas without immediately doubting them. I stopped seeing every challenge as proof that I was not good enough. One day, Professor Carter looked at my latest work and smiled. "You are finally seeing what I saw from the beginning," he said. I appreciated those words, but they also made me curious. Because the more I learned about him, the more I wondered about the professor who had once helped him. What was that person's story? And why did Professor Carter still carry that lesson with him after all these years? As the semester moved closer to its end, I began to realize that the biggest change was not my grades or my academic progress. The biggest change was the way I looked at myself. Before meeting Professor Michael Carter, I believed success meant handling everything without showing uncertainty. I thought asking questions made me look unprepared and admitting difficulties made me appear weak. But the conversations I had with him slowly changed that mindset. I started understanding that everyone, even the people who seem confident, has moments when they need guidance. The final weeks of the semester were filled with projects, presentations, and exams. Normally, that period would have overwhelmed me. But this time, I approached everything differently. I created a realistic schedule, communicated with my classmates, and allowed myself to learn instead of constantly worrying about being perfect. One afternoon, Professor Carter asked me to meet him before the final presentation for our research project. I expected feedback about my work, but instead, he asked me a question that surprised me. "Do you remember the person who walked into my office a few months ago?" I smiled because I knew exactly who he meant. I remembered feeling embarrassed, uncertain, and convinced that I had failed. Professor Carter continued, "That person thought he needed to hide every struggle. But the person sitting here now understands that growth takes honesty." Hearing that made me realize how much had changed. The difference was not that my challenges disappeared. I still had responsibilities, difficult days, and moments of doubt. The difference was that I no longer believed those moments defined me. During the final presentation, I felt nervous at first. Speaking in front of the class had always been difficult because I worried about making mistakes. But instead of focusing on what could go wrong, I focused on sharing what I had learned. When the presentation ended, Professor Carter gave me a small nod of approval. It was a simple gesture, but I understood what it meant. After class, several students talked about their own experiences with the semester. Some admitted they had also struggled with confidence and pressure. Listening to them made me realize that my experience was not unique. Many people carry invisible challenges while trying to appear fine. A few days later, I visited Professor Carter's office one last time before the semester ended. I wanted to thank him, but I also wanted to tell him something important. "I think I understand now why you noticed me that day," I said. He smiled and waited for me to continue. "Because someone noticed you when you needed it too." For a moment, he was quiet. Then he nodded and said, "Exactly." That conversation felt like the final piece of the lesson he had been teaching me all along. Helping someone does not always require a huge gesture. Sometimes it starts with paying attention. Sometimes it starts with one question, one conversation, or one moment when someone decides to care. As I left campus that evening, I thought about how different my life felt compared to the beginning of the semester. I entered that classroom thinking I was simply a tired student who had made a mistake. I left knowing that a single moment of understanding could completely change the direction of a person's journey. And I knew that the lesson Professor Carter gave me was something I would carry far beyond the classroom. The weeks after the semester ended gave me time to think about everything that had happened. When I looked back, it was surprising how one ordinary moment in a classroom had become such an important turning point in my life. I had entered that semester believing I needed to solve every problem alone. I thought being independent meant never admitting when things became difficult. But Professor Michael Carter showed me that real growth came from understanding myself and allowing others to support me when I needed it. A few months later, I returned to campus for a special event where former students and professors gathered to share their experiences. I did not expect to see Professor Carter there, but when I walked into the room, I noticed him speaking with a group of students. The scene reminded me of the first time I met him, when I thought he was only a strict professor who cared about rules and deadlines. Now I saw something completely different. I saw someone who had dedicated his career to helping people discover their own abilities. After the event, I approached him and thanked him again for everything he had done. He smiled and said that he was glad I had found my own path. I told him that our conversation after class had changed the way I looked at challenges. Before that day, I believed being noticed meant I had failed. Now I understood that being noticed could also mean someone believed there was more inside me than I could see. Professor Carter nodded and said something I never forgot. The goal is not to become someone who never struggles. The goal is to become someone who knows how to move forward when struggles appear. Those words stayed with me because they perfectly described the lesson I had learned. Life was not about avoiding difficult moments. It was about learning from them and becoming stronger through experience. As time passed, I continued using that lesson in different parts of my life. When I faced challenges at work, I approached them with more patience. When I felt uncertain about decisions, I remembered that growth required courage. I even found myself helping other people in the same way Professor Carter had helped me. I listened more carefully, asked better questions, and tried to notice when someone around me seemed to be carrying more than they showed. Looking back, I realized that Professor Carter never gave me a simple solution. He did something much more valuable. He helped me discover that I already had the ability to change. The person who fell asleep in that classroom was not lazy or incapable. He was simply overwhelmed and needed someone to remind him that he was still moving forward. That experience taught me that sometimes the most meaningful moments in life begin in unexpected ways. A mistake can become a lesson. A conversation can become a turning point. And one person choosing to notice another person can create a change that lasts for years. Several years have passed since that day in Professor Michael Carter's classroom, but I still remember the feeling of sitting at my desk with my head down, believing I had made the biggest mistake of the semester. At the time, I thought that moment would only be remembered as an embarrassing experience. I never imagined it would become one of the most important lessons of my life. Looking back now, I understand that the conversation after class was not really about sleeping during a lecture. It was about a person noticing another person at a moment when they needed support. After graduating, I continued building my career and facing new challenges. There were still moments when I felt uncertain, and there were still times when I questioned whether I was making the right decisions. But whenever those feelings appeared, I remembered the lesson Professor Carter shared with me. Progress was not about becoming perfect. It was about continuing forward even when things felt difficult. A few years after graduation, I returned to my old university to speak with current students about my experiences. Standing in the same hallway where I had once walked with embarrassment after class felt almost unreal. The campus looked familiar, but I was a different person. I no longer saw that younger version of myself as someone who had failed. I saw him as someone who was learning. While walking through the building, I passed Professor Carter's classroom. The door was open and I saw him teaching a new group of students. For a moment, I stood there remembering the first time he noticed me. The same professor who once seemed intimidating was now someone I considered one of the most important influences in my life. After his class ended, we talked for a while. I thanked him again and told him how much his words had affected me. He smiled and said that he did not remember every student he taught, but he always remembered the moments when someone needed encouragement. I asked him if he ever realized how much that one conversation had changed my life. He looked thoughtful for a moment and said, "Sometimes we never know the impact of a simple act of understanding." That answer stayed with me because it was true. Professor Carter probably never expected that a short conversation after class would become a memory I carried for years. He was simply doing what he believed was right. He listened, he noticed, and he gave someone the confidence to continue. Before leaving the university, I walked through the same classroom where everything began. I looked at the desk where I had once fallen asleep and smiled. That moment no longer represented embarrassment. It represented a turning point. It reminded me that people are more than their worst days. A tired student can still have potential. A mistake can still lead to growth. And a single conversation can sometimes become the beginning of an entirely different future. The greatest lesson I learned from Professor Michael Carter was not found in a textbook or written in an assignment. It was found in a simple act of kindness from someone who chose to pay attention. And years later, I still carry that lesson with me wherever I go.